Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. US threats of secondary sanctions on Iran and possible tariffs linked to Greenland are raising fresh concerns in Europe about trade law, regulatory sovereignty and the future of the WTO system when economic pressure is used not just against adversaries but also allies. The legal and commercial consequences can be profound. How exposed is the EU to these measures, and how much room does Europe really have to push back? Joining me is Tomasz Włostowski, Managing Partner at EU Strategies and a regular contributor. Welcome back, Tomasz. Good to see you.
Good evening.
Good evening. So secondary sanctions are now being threatened against Iran. Iran's already been under sanction by the US for a number of years. What difference is this going to make in terms of world trade, if any?
Well, let's keep in mind, US sanctions are an extremely powerful tool, mainly because of the US dollar and the role that it plays in sort of international trade, international economics, and how it's its importance in the global banking system. So basically what happens is that most banks around the globe really follow US sanctions, and the risk of getting hit by US secondary sanctions is extremely powerful, because what that means is that even if your own jurisdiction, for example, Europe or some other countries, don't impose any sanctions on you, the fact that you're sanctioned by the US basically means that most banks stop trading with you. And they stop servicing your transfers, they stop servicing your accounts. You're basically blocked, even though in your own jurisdiction you're not, just because the US sanctioned you. So it's an extremely powerful tool. And it is something that the US can influence, basically global trade and global events. The US resorts to it quite reluctantly, luckily for Europe, but yes, secondary sanctions are something Europe is particularly concerned about.
Okay, so that raises a number of issues. So, for example, if secondary sanctions were to be imposed on Iran, that would sanction countries that dealt with Iran. Well, there are relatively few of those, aren't there?
That is true. So because that is the second part of the equation, which is in the case of particularly Iran, I think we're also in a different place than we were in the past. I think there is no real ambivalence in Europe right now about the fact that basically the regime in Iran has done some very nasty things in the last, let's say, week, 2 weeks. And I don't think Europeans are considering their own sanctions on Iran. So let's keep that in mind. So it's going to be easier, I think, in particular for Europe to I don't want to use the word abide by US sanctions because we have our own sanctions, but I don't think that American pressure on Iran via secondary sanctions are going to cause a lot of pushback from the Europeans, because we are going to be sanctioning Iran anyway, maybe not to the same extent that the US will, but particularly Iranian, well, number one, what they did to their own population in the last week or so, but also the fact that they've so much aligned with the Russians in Russian war in Ukraine, that they've provided the drones and the drone technology to the Russians. I think that removed any ambivalence or any doubts in Europe about the need to go really strong against Iran.
Understood. Now, if I can just draw a parallel between secondary sanctions on Iran and secondary sanctions on Russia, which is also something that's been spoken about recently. So let's take, for example, India. India would be affected because it purchases oil from Russia at discounted prices. But if secondary sanctions were to be placed on India, then that would affect Europe. So, for example, Europe has, many European companies have shared service centres in India. They wouldn't be able to trade with them and so on. So there would be a knock-on effect on Europe, wouldn't there?
Well, there could be a knock-on effect, but I think we also need to take a step back, because the key question is really, and we didn't discuss it yet, the question is what exactly is meant by the US administration when they talk about secondary sanctions. Because typically what secondary sanctions, at least what they used to mean, is that if the U.S. sanctions a country or sanctions a certain entity, and some third country entities deal with that country or with that entity, they themselves get, those entities or those countries get basically sanctioned directly. And when I mean sanctions, what I mean is that they get sort of designated, and it's forbidden for anybody to do any business with them. Now, Trump has introduced this other idea, which was not normally referred to as secondary sanctions. And what he means by that is that he wants to tariff, the countries that are dealing with, for example, with Russia. This was the issue with India, that the point that you just made. And that's sort of a separate story, because it doesn't sort of remove that country completely from, let's say, economic trade with third countries. What it does is prevents your access to the US. So what I'm getting at is, I think the key element here is what Trump will mean by those secondary sanctions. Does he mean US tariffs on those countries, or does he mean actual secondary sanctions, basically OFAC, a unit of US Treasury, putting you on the blacklist? And those are much more painful.
Right, so there's a bit of blurring there in the terminology. Now, let's move to Greenland. Trump is threatening to impose tariffs on European countries that support Greenland's independence. How would he enforce something like that?
Look, well, how he would enforce? Well, I mean, he has ways, of course, of either tariffing those countries or sanctioning them in one way or another. I think that must be sort of remembered, is that under U.S. system, EU is not really an entity under U.S. sort of trade system. Normally, U.S. has tariffs on specific countries. So it's very for the United States to sort of isolate different European states in their tariffs. So they can impose a different tariff on Germany and a different tariff on Poland, or a different tariff on Spain. The Americans can do it. But I think we need to zoom out. And, President Trump, I think, has gotten too comfortable throwing these threats of tariffs at Europe. And the way that the European Commission in particular has dealt with Trump, and the way European leaders have dealt with Trump, basically being very appeasing, basically being very nice to him, and trying to appease him, it gave him, I think, a false sense of security that the Europeans on trade issues are going to fold. And that is, I think, breaking slowly in Brussels, in particular in the European Parliament. Because under the EU system, to get anything done on trade, you need the European Parliament's acquiescence to whatever you're doing. And we see that already with the tariff deal from July of last year, when the EU was supposed to lower its tariffs to zero in exchange for Americans abiding by 15% tariffs on the EU. That needs Parliament's permission. And it's already very clear that the Parliament is basically balking, in particular because of the unequal nature of the deal, the fact that there are continuous other threats against Europe, threats against Greenland, American requests for the EU to change its regulations, to stop punishing American companies for abuse of dominance, the Digital Markets Act, and so on. So basically, I think what Trump is going to very quickly realize, at least the American administration is going to face very quickly, is a complete balking by the Europeans on any further concessions. And we will see that. Just to give you an example, we have the European Parliament's plenary session next week in Strasbourg. There are two debates and one vote directly affecting US-EU trade relationship. There's a separate debate on Greenland and the threat to its sovereignty, and you can imagine how that debate's going to go. There is a vote on a report on EU-US trade relationship. There is very strong language about Greenland. There's a lot of concerns about various things the Americans are doing. And there's a separate debate also on EU sovereignty in international affairs and the threats to rule-based order. So this topic is becoming extremely political, and I think Trump is pushing at the boundary, and the thing is going to break any moment, and then we're entering a very dangerous moment when the Europeans are saying no more.
Right. So, I mean, what's the European response likely to be? Are they likely to basically impose tariffs on any US imports in exchange, which would hurt the US, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Look, if the scenario we're discussing is the Trump administration tariffing some member states or tariffing Greenland or Denmark or something, I think the response is as follows. First of all, the trade deal is gone. Like, there is no trade deal because the parliament's never going to approve, in my view, the tariff deal with the Americans from July last year, which basically means that the Americans are going back to the threats and imposing high tariffs on the EU. And in my view, in the situation we're in, the EU is going to retaliate. And just to give you a perspective, because it's easy to get lost, the trade that the EU has with the US is almost the same as the trade that the US has with both Canada and Mexico. This is the largest singular trade relationship in the world. It's 1.7 trillion. This is 4.6 billion a day. Like, we're talking now, and then, in 1 month, the EU trades with the US, what the EU trades with Mercosur in a year, right? The trade we have with the Americans, when we get to April, let's say, we just started a year. By the time we get to mid-May, the Americans will have traded with us everything they will trade that year with the Chinese, right? So everything that they trade with us from May to December this year is on top of their total trade with China. I mean, this is a monstrous trade relationship, and Trump doesn't realize, I think, the great damage he can do not only to the global economy and to the bilateral trade and to the bilateral economy, but also to the U.S. economy. And the one thing we need to keep in mind is that Trump has midterm elections in November this year. So any major escalation in trade relationship with such a huge trading partner as the EU is something he cannot, I think, take on board before midterms. And the one thing I think he seriously undermines is how deeply polarizing and how emotive the Greenland issue is. I don't think the Americans realize that they're breaking all goodwill in Europe, and it's really out the door. I mean, just the debates this next week, this will have never happened in the European Parliament to talk that way about the United States. I mean, all the goodwill is absolutely gone through the window.
Well, and he doesn't have that much support, in fact, very little support in the US as well, amongst the population as well as Congress. Tomasz, as always, so much more to talk about, but the clock's beaten us again. Thank you, and come and see us again soon. Have a good evening.
Until next time, good evening.
Until next time, bye-bye. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.